Thanks very much for the introduction. I'd like to begin the presentation, as I've done a couple times in conferences, by saying that I do not hold a doctoral degree, but I'd also like to thank the Air Health Science Working Group and the BC Lung Association for this invitation to speak in this webinar. It's an excellent time to start presenting the results of the urban transport exposure study. Just recently we've communicated the results to the transit authorities with whom we've collaborated in carrying out the study in the various heavy rail rapid transit and bus environments in Canada, and also to get some feedback from researchers with whom we've had work in several levels of government and academia as we conduct the analyses of our data and work towards publication, which will start with the first publication will be on the private vehicle data that we plan on submitting soon, and then following by publications on the exposures we've measured in bus transit environments and heavy rail rapid transit environments. So thanks for the invite. I'd like to begin the presentation just by, pardon me one moment. There we are. By giving an outline of the presentation which I'll be giving. Just moving some windows out of the way so I can see. There we are. So the outline of the presentation, I'll start with some information on the background and purpose of the urban transport exposure study, and then elements of its design and methodology which pertain to the exposure assessments that we did in all three urban transport environments that we selected: private cars, bus transit, and heavy rail rapid transit. Then we'll go into the results of each of these three modes, talking about the methods specific to each transit method, ultrafine particle levels, PM2.5, fine particulate matter, and then some results on progress we've made with modeling these exposures thus far. Then we'll finish with some conclusions and talk about the next steps that we'd like to take with the study data. This is probably a good time to make mention of the term heavy rail rapid transit. For a great deal of the time that I've been working on this study, I've been referring to this as subways. As we did heavy rail rapid transit exposures in Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver, I've learned that this term doesn't very well apply to Montreal, where the term is metro, and in Vancouver, where it's referred to as the SkyTrain. But I do believe that the term heavy rail rapid transit does include all these systems. So that's the term that I'm going to be using for subway. Here's some information on the background of the group with whom I've worked for the past 8 years. I work in the Air Division of Health Canada's Water and Air Quality Bureau. Our mandate is to assess risks associated with drinking water and outdoor air pollution, but for our group, we're definitely responsible for the air portfolio of that mandate. I've listed some names of other members in my group here, if some of you recognize some of these names, as I understand the audience today is quite diverse. Our main activities have to do with the Air Quality Health Index development and implementation. We also have groups dedicated to the assessment of risks associated with several air pollutants and the development of standards and guidelines of indoor and outdoor air quality. And also we have the group which I'm part of, the exposure assessment section, and our functions primarily have to do with research having to do with air pollution exposures and also air pollution epidemiology. Our studies are also designed to serve the other purposes of our group, in that we're interested in collecting air pollution exposure data that we find lacking in the literature and that we need for better assessments of risks, and the urban transport exposure study definitely served that purpose. So our funding comes from the Clean Air Regulatory Agenda, and one of the objectives of this agenda is to protect and promote the is to improve our understanding of health impacts from transportation-related air pollutant emissions, and part of filling that goal is conducting targeted personal exposure studies, taking a look at what Canadians are actually breathing in terms of transportation-related air pollution, and this is definitely the purpose behind the urban transport exposure study. Canadians spend approximately 5% of their day in transit, according to the Canadian Human Activity Patterns Survey, CHAPS and CHAPS 2. And StatsCan has made estimates that the average commute is approximately 26 minutes. So this is representing a small portion of the Canadian of a Canadian's day. However, it's definitely been suggested that the commuting environment represents air pollution levels that are elevated relative to the other environments that we occupy in our daily lives. So the urban transport environment represents a low proportion of our time, but a potentially higher contribution to our daily air pollution exposure for several pollutants. And if you look at the population of Canada since 1851, we've increased from 5 to just approximately 35 million people, but also with this increasing trend of population is the percentage of our population that lives in the urban environment, which is just over 80%. So when we decided to design a study that would take a look at Canadian commuter exposure, we definitely wanted to look in the urban parts of our country. And when we're looking at which kinds of methodologies, transport methodologies that we wanted to take a look at, the 2006 census shows that 80% of people are using their private car to get to work, and 10% using motorized public transport, so including heavy rail, rapid transit, and bus transit. So we're definitely interested in these three methods of transport. And then in terms of which cities we wanted to take a look at, we decided to target these three transport methods in 4 major metropolitans representing 38% of the Canadian population according to the 2011 census, this being Toronto, Ontario, Montreal, Quebec, Vancouver, British Columbia, and Ottawa, Ontario. And so that was the target of our study. We wanted to take a look at bus transit in Vancouver, Toronto, and Ottawa. We did heavy rail rapid in Vancouver, Toronto, and Montreal, and we did some private vehicle air pollution exposure work in Vancouver, Toronto, and Montreal. And I also want to say that within these major metropolitans, the percentage of people using private car and motorized public transit isn't 80% and 10% as it is nationwide, but more like 70 and 20% for all these metropolitans. So our study objectives were definitely to conduct an observational Canadian commuter air pollution exposure study. We targeted several well-known traffic-related air pollutants and the 3 major modes of urban commuter transport in 4 of Canada's largest metropolitans. And this data has several purposes. One is to support our ongoing air pollution risk assessments. We have two going on right now, carbon monoxide, and in the future ultrafine particles, as well as we anticipate eventually we'll be doing an assessment of black carbon, so we chose to quantify that, measure that air pollutant as well. But also we were hoping that we were also interested in VOCs and private vehicles. But the main reason being that, or one of the other purposes of the study, is that we would kind of create a benchmark of Canadian commuter exposures to which past levels could be compared, and also to which future levels of commuter exposures could be compared to assess the possible benefits of future regulations and interventions which will be introduced. Yeah. So as I said, we took a look at 3 transit methods, and for each transit method we took a look at 3 cities. And the study was done in 2 main campaigns. The first one was in the summer of 2010 and the winter of 2011. We did summer and winter sampling. We started with the heavy rail rapid transit methods of Toronto and Montreal, and we did those simultaneously. And then we did the bus transit methods of Ottawa and Toronto. And then following that, we did private vehicle sampling in Toronto and then Montreal. And then starting in December of 2012 in Vancouver, which is the beginning of the second portion of the study, we did private vehicle sampling followed by heavy rail rapid transit and then bus in the winter, and then in the summer of 2013 we did the same 3 methods in the same order. So another breakdown of when we did the sampling is shown by this table. As you can see, there was 2 main campaigns, the first being Toronto, Montreal, and Ottawa in 2010-2011, and then the final 2 main rows showing the sampling that we did in Vancouver in 2013. So in each 4 of these campaigns, we did, starting from the top in Toronto and Montreal, we did 3 weeks of sampling in the subway or the heavy rail rapid transit systems of Toronto and Montreal, followed by 3 weeks of sampling concurrently in Toronto and Ottawa bus systems, followed by 2 weeks of sampling in just Toronto. And then in the winter, in 2011, we did, again, 3 weeks of heavy rail rapid transit, followed by 3 weeks of bus, followed by 1 week of private car in Toronto, and then 1 week in Montreal private car environments. And then, again, Vancouver, 3 weeks, 2 weeks of heavy rail rapid transit, then bus, then private car, and again in the summer. If one way that I like to think about the data set that we have here is that we have 3 transit methods that we monitored: private car, bus, and heavy rail rapid transit. And for each of these transit methods, we did 3 cities. This was Vancouver and Toronto for all 3, and then for buses or for heavy rail rapid transit, we did Montreal, and for buses, we did Ottawa. And so for every combination of transit method and city, there was 2 weeks of 2 seasons of sampling, summer and winter, and then within each of these seasons, we did 3 weeks of sampling, except for private car where we did 2. And then within each week, we did 5 days, Monday to Friday, and 2 sessions every single day, 7 a.m. to 10 a.m. and 3 p.m. to 6 p.m. So we only targeted weekday commuting periods. So we're definitely, it's a commuter exposure study for sure. And so the entire data set is a large number of 3-hour periods, each being assigned to a transit method, a city, a season, and a week, a day of the week, and an AM or PM session. And then within every single one of these 3-hour periods, we had 3 technicians. We had, when we were assessing private vehicle exposures, we had 3 vehicles going at the same time. When we were in subway or light heavy rail rapid transit environments, we had 3 technicians, each assigned to a certain portion of the system. And when we were in bus transit environments, we had 3 technicians, each having its own, their own set of routes that they were covering. And the results of this organization and quantity of data collection is that we have just under 1,600 hours of heavy rail rapid transit exposure data, just over 1,400 hours of bus exposure, and just over 600 hours of private vehicle exposure data. So that is the scope of where and when we did our air pollution monitoring. Now, in terms of methods, how we monitored them. Just based on these photographs, you can see that starting with the left, and well, the left and the right, the setup was very much the same. Our 3 technicians had a backpack that contained several air monitoring technology methods, and also for the private vehicle sampling, we had an in-vehicle exposure setup, air pollution monitoring setup, and an out vehicle one. So we were concurrently measuring our air pollutants both in and outside of our vehicles. Whereas with bus and heavy rail, it was strictly, well, just personal exposure, as you can imagine. In terms of the methods that we employed in monitoring our air pollutants, this is a table showing all of the methods that we use that were on a continual basis, that were logging information at a high temporal resolution. So just starting with the pollutants, top left, the dust track measuring continuous PM2.5 data. It's a very useful tool, and it's been used in a lot of our studies. It's a robust, reliable piece of equipment. But one thing with the dust track is that you always have to remember that when you're collecting data with this unit, there is a bias to the air pollution exposure levels that it gives you. It gives you an excellent trend analysis. You can see how PM2.5 can change over time. But co-locating this method with the gravimetric method is always good practice, so you can compare it to the gravimetric method, and as it usually compares very well, it's correlated very well to a gravimetric method. That kind of analysis will tell you what kind of bias the dust track is showing. For example, in a lot of the indoor and outdoor air pollution monitoring that we've done in our group and in other research groups as well, you'll see that the dust track will overpredict PM2.5 from values ranges 1.5 to 3 times. So that was what we used for continuous PM2.5. We measured ultrafines using the CPC 3007, black carbon using the microethylometer, and we also measured carbon monoxide using the Langman, but that was only done in private vehicles. And we also measured GPS so that we could merge our air pollution exposure data with a lot of explanatory variables having to do with spatial analysis. And we measured temperature, relative humidity, and we also had the digital voice recorder. This was used for integrating into our air pollution exposure data a lot of factors about the environments in which we were sampling, but we'll get to that later. So that was all of our continuous methods. And we also had integrated methods. These are samples that represent a certain portion of time. Starting with the Ogawa badge, NO2 and SO2, these samples were deployed for 3-hour periods. As I was saying, the entire study is a collection of 3-hour periods, and one Ogawa was used to give us a number for NO2 and SO2 for each of these periods. I only have data for that for private vehicles today. We also did SUMA canisters, VOCs, in private vehicles only, so that every single 3-hour period we would have a measure of several VOCs. And lastly, the personal environmental monitor, the PEM. This is our gravimetric method. We did PM2.5 and PM10 for 2 reasons. One, we wanted to have a gravimetric method with which we could compare our dust track data, and 2, we wanted to do elemental analysis of our particulates using ICP-MS, and those results I have we'll talk about later. So those are the pollutants and the methods by which we measured them. Also, along with our exposure data, we have several types of descriptive data that we collected. As I mentioned, the digital voice recorders. These were used to make observations during private car traffic, diesel count, whether we were going through a construction zone or not, our ventilation settings, bus transit and heavy rail rapid transit, things like boarding and disembarking, whether our technicians were waiting at a stop or in a car or bus, station names, IDs of our cars and buses, and other types of information. Geospatial data, land use, traffic counts, road network information, and so that we could calculate also distance to point sources such as air and seaports, and meteorology data that we're using in our analysis we got from Environment Canada, and we also have some central site ambient data that we got from the National Air Pollution Surveillance Network, which is a Canada-wide network of ambient air pollution monitoring, which is a collaboration with a lot of provincial and municipal groups all contributing to one large data set. There were 16 stations in Montreal, 2 in Ottawa, 7 in Toronto, and 13 in Vancouver. When we compare this data to our own, what we're doing is we take the data which is available from all of these sites and we average it all into a single number for every hour. So our comparisons here today are done with that kind of approach, and we may consider improving that by connecting our data to rather the closest station, but that's under discussion. So our statistical methodology that we've applied in trying to model or develop a predictive model for the air pollution exposure levels that we've found in these transit methods. Our dependent variables so far have been fine particulate matter with the dust track data, ultrafine particles, and black carbon. And this has been trying to predict the personal levels that we measured in the buses and subways and the in-vehicle measures in the cars, which can be considered the same thing. The predictors that we've been using are the same ones that I've mentioned before, and the methodologies that we've been using. So far we have some modeling results for private cars, and with this approach we used a data set that represented an average for every 3-hour period. So in that analysis we used a multivariable linear model, but we're also playing with using the data set at a 1-minute temporal resolution, and in a situation, we've got 180 data points for each hour, and in that approach we used a linear mixed regression analysis, as this method can adjust the error estimates for the fact that every single 3-hour period has got 180 observations that are more related to each other than they are other data, because they're collected in series. So that's it for the background and methodology of the study. Now we'll go into the results section, starting with the private cars, then the buses, and rapid transit. So for the private car methods, these are 3 maps showing our GPS data for bottom left Vancouver, top right Montreal, and bottom right Toronto. With the buses and subways, we had a very balanced amount of sampling that we did with every city season combination, but this was not the case with private vehicles. We did a full 4 weeks in Vancouver, 2 summer, 2 winter. In Toronto we did 2 summer and 1 winter, and that second winter week was, we did that in Montreal because we were interested in getting a little bit more variability in our data. And so as I said, most of our methods were continuous, but we had those integrated samples, the NO2 and VOCs, and every single one of those numbers represented a 3-hour period. So when we had our 3 technicians, we assigned one strictly to highways, Trans-Canada highways, 4 series highways, the bigger volume roads, and another vehicle was assigned to inner city roads with a mix of local and arterial roads, and then our third vehicle was committed to the outer city areas of these metropolitans. A little bit more specifics on the methods in terms of the private vehicle sampling. We kept the recirculation ventilation setting off. That means that the air inside the vehicle was always being drawn from the outside. This factor was controlled for as were windows always closed, and all of our vehicles were Dodge Grand Caravans, model years 2009 to 2012. So these are the factors that we controlled for. And as I said, we had 3 different types of routes that we worked on, and every single AM session route that we did was reflected in the evening when we did our sampling. And the types of recordings that we made, we had a selection area around our vehicle, 5 seconds ahead of us, and our own lane plus any neighboring lanes of same direction of traffic. And we did simply a count of the number of diesels that we could see in this area, and also an ordinal scale for traffic. It was 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4, just to kind of get an idea of how much congestion there was around us. The indoor and outdoor air pollution levels that we measured, they tracked each other very well for PM2.5, as you would expect with our recirculation setting off. And the same for PM2.5. These are just 2 examples, with the out-vehicle exposures typically being higher than the in-vehicle exposures. Here's a table of indoor-outdoor ratios This is all cities combined. So we have our summer data, which represents Toronto and Vancouver, and our winter, which represents all three cities. And as you can if you just look at the medians here, most of them are less than 1. This is simple interpretation of these values is simply to say, for example, UFP in total is 0.62. The indoor vehicle levels were approximately 62% of what was being measured outside. So by looking at these meetings, you can see for most of the pollutants that we measured, UFP, black carbon, PM2.5, NO2, well, skip NO2 for a second. Most of the levels that we were measuring in vehicle were lower than out vehicle. Out with NO2, we're approaching closer to 1, and you can see for BTECs, that's benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, and xylenes, that the levels inside the vehicles were, tended to be higher than the levels outside the vehicle, and we kind of suspected that may be due to the fact that all of our vehicles were quite new, and so there can still be some off-gassing taking place. As I said, one of the purposes behind the study was to provide a benchmark, not only to which future levels could be compared, but also that we could compare our levels to levels collected in the past. And one example of this is benzene levels. In 1994, we conducted a Commuter study that had to do with private vehicle sampling in Toronto, and they were looking at in-vehicle exposures to VOCs, one species being benzene, and this box plot here shows levels for the summer and winter sampling done in '94, and then the final 5 box plots represent every combination of city and season that we conducted private vehicle sampling. And as you can see, there's been a drastic reduction in in-vehicle benzene levels from compared between these two studies, and that wasn't very surprising, but it was worth looking at as benzene levels in Toronto over the past 2 decades have been generally decreasing. This is thought to be a result of increased standards in terms of emission standards and fuel content. This, by the way, this is data from the National Air Pollution Surveillance data. The '94 Commuter study, our study, and NAPS, they all use SUMA canisters, so, and the same labs, so it's pretty decent comparison. And this kind of trend in benzene levels that's seen here in these 2 Toronto NAP stations can definitely be seen across the country. We measured in-vehicle NO2, as I was saying. The levels were, well, it was a bit tricky using NO2 because I wasn't sure if 3 hours was going to be enough time for the Ogawa pads to get enough mass so that most of the levels would be detectable. But we were dealing with an environment of typically higher levels of NO2, or as we anticipated them to be. So the percent of the levels that were above detection was quite high, actually, except for Vancouver summer. We had, I think, 24% of our samples were below detection for NO2. And as you can see, typically the levels that we've seen in the vehicles are around 50 ppb. This is a spatial map for Montreal, ultrafine particles. So again, this is just winter for Montreal, and the scale here is showing UFP levels from 10,000 to over 100,000 parts per cubic centimeter. The higher levels can be seen on the major highways, and this kind of trend for road type for UFPs is seen also in Toronto, as you can kind of make out, because we have summer and winter data here. This is more a representation of the spatial variation of the data, of the UFP data collected in Toronto. Those of you who are familiar with Toronto, that yellow line along the top, I wonder if I can point again. Along here, this is 401, and which is a major Trans-Canada route for trucking. And we also have a high-volume highway series here, the Don Valley Parkway, the Gardiner, and the 427. So the UFPs we measured definitely the highest in these areas, which were also shown to have much higher diesel counts. And again, in Vancouver, the Trans-Canada Highway here, going through Vancouver. And also we found some high levels going through tunnels, which was present in Montreal and Vancouver. And here's a representation of the UFP levels that we measured. Definitely a seasonal trend here in terms of winter and summer in Vancouver. Again, in Toronto, a big seasonal trend for UFPs seen. And yeah, PM 2.5 private vehicle. Winter in winter in Montreal and Toronto, summers saw the highest levels of PM 2.5 measured by the dust track. Earlier I mentioned the bias which can come from using the dust track for measuring PM 2.5 and how usually we see over predictions of 1.5 to 3. We've shown to be a lot lower here with our private vehicle sampling, which gives a little bit more credits to the data. And these are the results for modeling in-vehicle exposures to ultrafine particles, fine particles, and black carbon. This is a multivariate linear regression. We were able to explain 53% of the variability for UFP and less so for PM 2.5 and black carbon. The predictors being very similar between pollutants having to do with highways or road type, temperature, and wind speed. Bus transit. I'm going to go quickly through bus transit. It seems I'm cutting into the available time that I have. Again, with the DVR recording that we did, we wanted to record the bus stops and the bus ID numbers that we had. And we went through the selection of bus routes available in each city, and we tried to pick the most used ones, but also to get some geographical coverage of each city, as was shown in the last slide. UFP levels, they weren't particularly high. Again, we see a seasonal trend in all 3 cities for UFPs. And for UFPs that we measured in our 3 cities for in UTES were generally lower than others found in the literature. Definitely not exhaustive representation of literature in terms of UFP levels of buses. This is a spatial map for the PM 2.5 levels that we saw. Generally they're 10 to over 50 micrograms per cubic meter with the dust track. The Ottawa bus transit system is of note because where in Vancouver and Toronto you have bus systems that are working with the heavy rail rapid transit systems in those cities. In Ottawa we don't have any heavy rail. We have one line of rail transit with 5 stops that we did measure, but for the majority, of the sampling, well, 2/3 of the sampling that we did in Ottawa, we dedicated it to the dedicated bus lines that were meant to go across city, shown in this area here and like that. So the bus system of Ottawa is kind of like a subway in that regard. A lot of variability in the levels for PM 2.5 in Toronto as well. I forget what the name of this road was, but it seemed to be definitely showing some regional trend of PM 2.5 and lower levels seen in Vancouver. The scales of these maps are all identical. And representation of the PM 2.5 levels we measured in bus transit relative to those found in literature, and generally lower. And so far our progress for modeling bus exposure for ultrafine particles, we found associations with station design. This is in reference to our data collected while waiting at bus stops. There was much higher levels in indoor bus stations versus outdoor bus stops. The bus age that the technicians were on, and again other factors similar to the models seen for private cars. For PM 2.5, very much the same selection of criteria, but we've got a lot more modeling work to do. This is a little bit more of an explanation of relating ambient PM 2.5 to bus levels. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to skip it. I'm running out of time, and I'd like to talk about heavy rail rapid transit. But we'll be looking at that same kind of analysis in heavy rail rapid transit. So I'll be able to talk to that. So the three systems of heavy rail rapid transit that we took a look at, Vancouver, Montreal, and Toronto, all very similar actually in terms of length, around 67, 68 kilometers in system length, but remarkably different in terms of system design. For instance, Toronto started building its subway system in '54 and has done various extensions all the way through 2002. Montreal started in '66, and for Vancouver, their system is relatively younger, with I believe the latest addition being the Canada line, which was around mid-2000, I think around 2005, or no, 2000, I'm sorry, there's a window covering my, 2006, 2009. So similar length, very different in design. Other factors of design that are different are things like the Montreal system. It's completely underground / indoors. I put / indoors because some of the subway stations are quite shallow in the ground, and but still indoors, and that having to do with their wheel design. Is a picture of it here. This is one of the subway cars in Montreal, and showing that they use rubber wheels rather than steel wheels, which is used in the Toronto and Vancouver systems. And with this kind of sampling or system design factor, you really need to keep it sheltered from the elements. So most of the system is, or the entirety of the system is underground and indoors. Toronto is predominantly subterranean. There are some stations and sections that are outdoors, and then you have Vancouver. And I'll just go back to the other slide for a second. This is Vancouver, this whole section of the system here, and around here. This is all above ground and elevated, as you can see in this picture here, so very different in terms of design. The route selection, we did all three of these systems almost in their entirety. The technicians, they did a pattern of riding and disembarking, and they disembarked at every single station, waited for the next train, and boarded it, so we got an equal or balanced amount of representation for the system in terms of waiting and riding. And like the other parts of the study, we did the PM routes mirrored those of the AM routes. The technicians recorded information such as the station names and the car identification numbers, and they always occupied the middle of the platform, as U of T done some work to show that that can vary substantially on a platform, whether you're at one station, one end of the platform or the other. And UFP exposures were pretty low for this transit environment, which could be expected since all three systems run on electric propulsion. So there's not a lot of burning of, well, there's virtually no burning of fossil fuels down there. And the one exception being service vehicles. So that's all I have to say about UFPs. PM2.5 is a much more interesting landscape. This is the same scale used for the buses. This is Montreal. This is both summer and winter, so it's more showing the seasonal or the regional, the spatial differences in PM2.5 that we measured in the subway environments of Montreal. This is Toronto. Take note of the scale here. I had to change it to show some kind of contrast in this map. Whereas the Montreal and the Vancouver system maxes out at 50. The scale here is 50 to 250 micrograms per cubic meter of PM2.5. With also an emphasis showing here that the levels that we found on platforms are typically higher than the ones that we found while riding. This is true for Montreal as well as Toronto and Vancouver. And as I mentioned earlier, this is the section of the Vancouver system that's underground, and we found typically higher levels of PM2.5. But again, we're back to the same scale as Montreal here in terms of PM2.5. So there's a lot of variability in the PM2.5 data that we saw throughout the heavy rail rapid transit portion of the study. And here's a box plot showing the PM2.5 levels of the various combinations of season and city for the heavy rail rapid transit portion of the study. And again, talking about the relationship between the dust track data, which is excellent for giving information on variability over time, but its tendency to overpredict. It seems for the PM2.5 data that we have here, the amount of PM2.5 that was measured by the dust track was very similar to that of the gravimetric, as you can see by the slope factor here, very close to 1-to-1 comparison between PM2.5 by our gravimetric method and our dust track, and very high R-squared here. So it's the PM2.5 data collected is very credible in terms of amount. But there is going to be a caveat here, and it's that for the sections of PM2.5 data that were collected in the Vancouver outdoor locations, this relationship, well, I'm going to have to take another look at it, since that PM is going to be mostly ambient. And relative to other PM2.5 data collected in the heavy rail rapid transit studies that have been done, Montreal and Vancouver are generally on par, with Toronto being more on the higher scale of PM2.5. This bar here represents a study that was done in 1998 by a group of researchers from the Research Triangle Institute, I think, and their levels of PM2.5 that they measured in Toronto subways were very similar to our own. Also similar for PM10 and levels of manganese, that portion of the PM that was measured. So in terms of our modeling, we have found station age and car age to be a factor for PM2.5, or for UFPs, station age for PM2.5, whether the station was indoors or outdoors, and several other factors. This graph shows the composition. This is the ICPMS results that I was talking about. That we took our PM2.5 and our PM10. This is just PM2.5. We took our PM2.5 samples and we analyzed them for our elemental content. And they represented a high portion of the total PM2.5 material that we had on our filters. We've got Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver here for each summer, and but take note of the non-ICPMS portion. This is the remainder of the PM that was uncharacterized by the ICPMS analysis. So we have, let's start with Vancouver here, we have 64% and 43% unexplained by the results of ICPMS, but we're showing a high portion of iron, definitely, well, most likely having to do with the section that was underground, as it has steel wheel and steel rail system as Toronto does, but also this portion here, this is actually not having to do with the ICPMS analysis. This is the black carbon measurements that was done with the microethylometer. It measures black carbon in nanograms per cubic meter. So I added that to this graph to kind of represent how much of the PM was represented by that. With Montreal, again, we have a large portion uncharacterized, higher portion of copper than the other systems, possibly having to do with the braking system in their system. And then here we have Toronto. We'll start with summer here, and we can characterize most of the PM 2.5 measured in this system by several other elements. There's 36 in all, so there's a lot of elements grouped into this portion. 59% iron and 33% black carbon. But for some reason in the summer or in the winter, more of the PM is uncharacterized by the elemental analysis and the black carbon, which is interesting and we're looking into. So then the last part of the presentation, I want to talk about, so try not to interpret this right now. Don't interpret these graphs right now. I'm going to explain it all. This has to do with PM 2.5 we measured in the subway systems. This is winter and this is summer, and this is the relationship between the spatially averaged NAPS PM 2.5 estimate and the PM 2.5 that we were measuring in the subways. In the winter for Toronto, there wasn't that. There is some relationship between the PM 2.5 we were measuring in the subways in Toronto and the PM 2.5 exposures outdoors. And that is to say that there was infiltration of some component of ambient PM 2.5 in the subways. And the reason that we have two lines here is because this is all the data pertaining to waiting at subway stops. And this relationship shows the the relationship while riding. And what is to take note of this is that is the y-intercept. With a certain portion of the PM, which is ambient source, it kind of gives you an estimate of how much of the PM 2.5 we were measuring was due just to sources within the subway system as well, and how that number is much lower for the sampling that we did while riding versus while waiting at platforms. I have this data also for Montreal. Riding and waiting, very similar in terms of the relationship of the measurements that we were making versus the spatially averaged NAPS PM 2.5. And also here in the winter time in the Montreal subways, we see that there is a portion of PM 2.5 that was waiting, that was sourced directly from the system itself. But this portion, the y-intercept, seems to virtually disappear in summer, which is something else we'll be looking into. I have to make note of this third relationship here. One other thing to note is that the PM 2.5 relationships between the PM 2.5 and the subways versus outside, it was much higher for Montreal than it was for Toronto. And this third piece here, I have to say that while we were in the Toronto subways, because it was completely underground and in part of the cooperation with the transit authority there were a select number of stations, 6 in all, where the technicians were instructed to go outside to street level and do some street level sampling. That's why it's called street level. And as you can see, for these portions of time that we were on street level, the relationship between the measurements we were taking in ambient were very strong with virtually no local source since they were outside. But this was only done in Montreal. And again, for Vancouver, much higher relationship than Toronto, and again, most of it is outside. The conclusions that we've made so far, VOC levels have gone down, at least in Toronto, but probably elsewhere as well, on account of the interventions and the changes of standards that we were talking about in terms of fuel content and emissions. We found levels that were notably higher than ambient, and well, that's pretty much it. The next steps, complete the personal exposure models. We're thinking our approach is to moving forward to do them by transit method, city, and pollutant. So that's a total of 9 models, 3 transit methods, 3 cities for each, and 3 pollutants, black carbon, ultrafines, PM 2.5. And in doing that, we'll see if we can improve the models for private car using the higher temporal resolution. We also want to assess this, the potential of these models, if they're highly predictive enough to predict or to be of use to any kind of air pollution epidemiology uses in refining air pollution exposures and reducing exposure misclassification. And we also want to take a look and use this data to try and see if we can make any estimates towards how much exposure people are getting from commuting, what it's contributing to the total exposure. And I wanted to talk about one study by Transport Canada that's doing a kind of a representative sample of our private vehicle commuters in Canada, but we don't have time for that. And I'd like to finish by saying that this work has been possible because of the internal collaborators, the people that I've worked with. Dr. Scott Weikenthal, Lance Wallace has been excellent to work with in the data interpretation, and Dr. Huixin Shin from Health Canada in terms of statistical analyses, and a lot of other people. And at the beginning of the study, we were able to, I started it off with a lot of help from Dr. Greg Evans and Dr. Kelly Sabakulias, sorry Kelly, and also Dr. Mark Gibson with the Yoga analyses. And through field technicians that I got from engineering departments of U of T, McGill, Carleton University, and the science department of UBC, they were excellent, and through cooperation with the transit authorities. Sorry that was so rushed, everyone. I'll take your questions now. Okay, just bear with me. Kelly, are you there? Oh no. Okay, everyone, I've figured out the table showing the questions now. I'll be starting to answering them. The first one from Chantal Duhame asking if she can see the presentation, that she can only see the title, and she can see it now, and that's really good because I didn't see that before. First question here, could the higher indoor-outdoor ratios for BTEX be due to the air filter which reduces particle levels but not gas concentrations? Let's see. BTEX, air filter. That's an excellent question. I suppose if the lower levels that we're seeing in the vehicles for a lot of the particle pollutants is having to do with the efficiency of the filter, I suppose that's possible. And it having no effect on the VOCs, that's an interesting idea. And if it indeed is true that the VOCs are getting in without any issue, then the higher indoor levels could possibly be due to trapping mechanisms, perhaps, that they're being introduced faster than they're being cleaned out. So that's possible. But there are a lot of studies talking about higher indoor VOC levels for newer cars on account of off-gassing that seems to happen after manufacturing for several months. So. Thank you for your question, Lance. Eric Saganik. Sorry, Eric. Thank you for your question. It's how did you get GPS data in the tunnels underground? Well, as you may have noted, for the explanatory variables that we've found so far for the subway data, none of them have to do with land use data. And as you may have also noted, when I was talking about the PM2.5 that we measured in the subways, there's definitely an ambient component to them. So theoretically, some of these variables could be a factor in predicting the subway exposures. So what we did was every time our technicians recorded arriving at a station, we tagged the latitude and longitude of that station, and then they would make the recording again that they were leaving it, and the next recording when they arrived at the next station. So every time they were at a station, we tagged it with the location. For all the portions in between when they were riding, we did an extrapolation of the latitude and longitude. But we did that with UTMX since they're in meters, and it made more sense. So thank you for your question, Eric. Okay. What was the budget for this project? Eric, in terms of analysis and staff, the amount of money that this study cost was $300,000 over 4 years. Tarek Ayashi, I'm sorry I'm mispronouncing everyone's last name. What was the time average of the concentrations presented? That was all the concentrations that you saw for the maps had to do with spatial average of 1 minute resolution data. For bus stops, they needed at least 10 minutes of data for it to be represented, and also for the box plots, we did averages hourly, and in preparing the data for the box plots. James Montgomery, the Toronto UFP concentration map showed the highest near the 427-401 intersection. Can you determine if this is a result of the airplanes from the airport or the traffic congestion at that location? Thanks for your question, James. That's an excellent point. For a lot of the UFP maps, I didn't show them all, but for a lot of the UFP maps, we definitely see that there seems to be higher levels closer to the airports, and each of these cities has an international airport, so a lot of activity, and distance to airport is going to be one of the predictors that we're going to be looking at in developing our UFP models. Also, I've been there was a paper published in 2009 by UBC, I think it was UBC, that they attempted to make a land use regression model for ultrafine particles, and some of the main predictors that they found had to do with proximity to the port in Vancouver, which is a very major one, and also concentration of restaurants, and I think their third main predictor of their final model had to do with major road length within a certain buffer zone. We've definitely found the relationship for UFPs and major road length, but we'll be taking a look at distance to port and restaurants based just, it seems prudent to check since they found a relationship. Greg Baitalan, do you know if radon gas has ever been measured in tunnels and subways, and if so, the concentration? No, I'm not aware of any radon gas monitoring in subterranean sections of the subways in Canada, Greg. Sorry, I can't comment on that. Greg Evans, any thoughts on the difference of the indoor-outdoor ratios of carbon monoxide versus NO2 in the vehicles? Greg, it's an excellent question, and definitely be taking a look at that since we're still doing a lot of data exploration, and I look forward to talking to you on that question since I don't have any thoughts on it right now. Another question from Greg Baitalan. Could the iron detected be related to the newer non-asbestos pads with high metal content? That's an excellent question, Greg. Tracing the elemental exposures that we've measured in the 3 transit methods that we've done is definitely going to be a large task. And some people I've read some about one way to trace that is by looking at elemental ratios, which is I think the only method open to us because source apportionment modeling has been done, but you need a lot more data than we have, and we don't have a lot of PM10 and PM2.5 samples. So I don't know what our strengths are with our limited sample size, but I'm hoping that we can take a look at the elemental ratios that we've measured with our samples, and the elemental ratios in brake pads, in the steel rails, and the steel wheels to be able to talk intelligently about what kind of sources there's been for these PM2.5 and PM10 exposures that we've measured in these environments. But it also, with this work, it opens up avenues for future research. Perhaps more study can be done with that, and hopefully the UTES data set can help develop that kind of direction. Jennifer Miller, could you message me again if you're still there? You asked me to go back to the summary slide, and I'd like to do that for you if you're still there. I have one last question here from Lance Wallace. Some studies have found an effect. Okay, 1 second, Jennifer. Thanks for messaging again. Lance Wallace, some studies have found an effect of vehicle speed on in-vehicle pollutant levels. Did you include vehicle speed in your initial selection of inputs to the models? I think Scott Weikenthal did the analysis for our one private vehicle model, and I think he did take a look at that factor, but in the final model, the final variable selection for our best models, I don't think it was included. Let me just look really quickly. I'm pretty sure it wasn't. No, just wind speed, but not vehicle speed. Okay. Actually, that brings us to 2 p.m. Jennifer, I am going to send the slides out. The presentation will be provided to everybody. And please, the first slide has my email address. If you have any questions for me, feel free to contact me. And thank you very much for your attention.